Hey guys, what's up? It's your man Pete, and it's Selling Toronto back at it again, and we are going to do an episode today talking about commercial lending and why you should be investing in commercial properties. I've got John Wong here from the Mortgage Center, who's got loads and loads of experience in the commercial lending and banking side of things. So whenever I have any questions, commercial or multi-residential or investment properties, I always go to John and I get great answers from him. I'm going to ask John a few questions today just to get you guys acquainted with commercial real estate and lending, and hope this is helpful to you. It's not too tight for you?
No, okay.
I'm going to do a little bit of a test here. I don't want to hit anybody, it's dangerous. Okay, well, John, thanks for being on the show. Really appreciate it, man. Thanks for...
Well, thanks for inviting me, Peter.
Yeah, it's fun, and we had a chat earlier in the week, and I think we're going to do a really good video today. So, John, who should be buying commercial real estate, and why should they be buying commercial real estate in this market here today?
I would say that for commercial real estate, it's probably better suited for those who are currently investors. You own maybe 2 or 3 houses already. Mm-hmm. The reason this is ideal is because you understand the market a little better, so you're not a beginner, but also you understand the process, right? Sometimes, the whole borrowing and closing process can be a bit daunting, and so without that experience and jumping into commercial, it could be even more daunting. It's really for those who are looking to do a step up, just to jump into a little more complexity, a little more challenge. And I find through my years of experience that there are a lot of those that who are currently investing in residential. They do want to jump to the next level, to take on a bit of a challenge and really do something very exciting.
So why is it considered the next level? Like, what makes it? Is it higher returns? Is it higher rents, more cash flow? Like, what's the reason why somebody would want to go into it and sort of take on a bigger risk? Because it is a bigger risk to go into the commercial market, right?
In some ways, it's certainly, I would say that the key reason why people get into commercial is basically diversification. You get access to various different asset classes, different types of cash flow streams, different kind of tenants. And the best example I could give is, imagine you are currently investing in the market, right? Bonds and stocks. Uh-huh. When you have a portfolio, you generally don't buy IBM or Apple 100% of it. You want to diversify because you want to spread out that risk of yours. Mm-hmm. So you might have some that are safer, maybe bonds, and you also want to take some risk because this risk is where the higher returns are.
Okay.
So in the same vein, by diversifying your real estate portfolio, what happens is you're spreading out the risk, but also taking the opportunity to generate more returns for yourself as well.
So, I mean, I have heard and known as well a lot of sort of Asian investors or Asian buyers who are going into the commercial market, and they specifically like the commercial market. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that there is a bit of fatigue for sure when it comes to residential. It's very competitive. There's a lot of bidding wars, and there's the Chinese investors are foreign buyers, for instance, as an example. They might not be able to access lending from that perspective.
Okay.
Whereas in the commercial market, they use different metrics, and so it may open up some doors to acquiring commercial real estate. But on top of that, again, the same reasons as well. Some Chinese and foreign investors already own a portfolio of maybe 5 or 10 houses. For them, it's a matter of diversifying their real estate portfolio as well and getting into other asset classes. They're in the commercial space.
Okay. So what's the difference between the lending ratios for residential versus commercial? Like, what's the max amount that you think you can actually borrow for a commercial property?
Right. So I'll try to compare that with something we're a little more familiar with, which is the residential market. Generally speaking, banks will look at your house or the property you're buying and versus your personal income. So the carrying cost of your property that you bought cannot be more than 35% of what your gross income is. That's how they look at it, called the gross debt service. Mm-hmm. In commercial, actually, they don't look at it at all the same way. They use what's called a debt service coverage. What does that mean? That means that the revenue that you derive or you earn from a commercial real estate should be at least, say, 1.2 times to 1.25 times the carrying cost of your commercial real estate. And that includes your mortgage and your operating expenses. So the metrics are a little different. So it's really more of a language in how they speak more than anything else. And certainly with a little bit more risk, the ratios are probably a little tighter than you say with a residential property.
So okay, so the lending amount max that you see probably is what, like?
I would say so. In residential, generally speaking, we have 80%, right? And that determines whether,
Or even 90 or 95, right?
well,
That's
the
possible
90,
too.
95 will jump into, and I was going to say that the 80% determines whether you're going to go with a conventional or insured mortgage.
Okay.
So 80% or lower in terms of the mortgage, we classify that as a conventional mortgage. If you borrow more than that, then it's CMHC insured, in which you have to pay a premium just to get the insurance. With commercial real estate, they look at it differently. If you have an apartment, which is called commercial, you can get into CMHC insurance, but most of them aren't into that category. So on average, I would say the maximum loan amount will range between 55 and 65%.
55, 65 max, right?
Max.
Okay, so what's considered commercial for multi-residential or apartment? What's that line between it being sort of like a multiplex or a fourplex where it's considered commercial? Like how many units, how many doors are we talking about?
So I would say in terms of a number of units, and different lenders will vary. The line is not exactly hard-coded, but generally speaking, between 4 and 5 units is where the cutoff point is, and which point it'll jump to a classification as a commercial. And maybe it takes time to define what commercial is versus something like a condominium or
Sure,
a house.
go ahead, yeah.
Generally, even though investors buy a house, for instance, and rent it out, and you may think it's a commercial, it is still classified as a residential because the use is to live in. By definition, a commercial property is a real estate that generates its own income. So what I mean is we have what traditionally the lenders will call the four food group. So it would be industrial. It would be multi-residential, so apartment buildings. It'll be office tower, and it'll be retail, like a retail plaza. So those are the 4 main groups of commercial asset classes that lenders look at.
Okay.
And they all have their own tenants, and they all generate their own income.
So basically what you're saying is, so for an investment property, sort of an investment commercial property, from a lending perspective, they're mostly looking at the net operating income, right? The
Correct.
NOI. So how much, rent is actually being generated to cover this property? Or are they still also looking at your personal covenant and whether you can afford to pay the rent in case it goes vacant?
Okay, that's actually a very good question. For a commercial property, lenders will generally look at primarily as net operating income. So how that is defined is basically your rent, subtracting any operating expenses. So that would be heat and hydro, realty taxes, insurance, things like that. And what you get is your net operating income. And that's important for a lender because after that, is there enough to pay the mortgage? And so ultimately for most lenders, that is always going to be the key metric because lenders don't want to be landlords.
Yeah.
Now, does covenant come in play? Yes, it does. But in a different way than perhaps we would look at a residential property.
Okay.
For instance, if you bought a house just to rent out, the lenders will only recognize 50% of your rental income. What that means, it forces the lender to look at the personal income of the purchaser. And that's if you were to buy a house or a condo. If you're buying a commercial property, your personal income is actually not really looked at. What's more important is what your net worth is. Because what they want to know is should the property becomes vacant, so imagine you have a retail strip and you have 5 tenants. If one of them leaves or goes out of business, you really have a vacancy. So what they're more concerned is, do you have the income or net worth money to pay the mortgage to offset any tenants have gone vacant.
Okay.
Right. And you mentioned vacancy rates. So generally speaking, most lenders will, for any commercial property, apply a market vacancy. So in any given market, say for an apartment building, for a certain region, the vacancy may be say 5% or 10%. They will apply that because that's the general market vacancy, and so that becomes part of the metric.
Okay, so is the idea that, I mean, so it sounds like you do have to put more money into a commercial property, like the down
Correct.
payment's got to be quite large. Does that mean that like there's a higher chance for the properties to cash flow? Because as we know, for all residential properties in Toronto, it just like the numbers just don't make sense. At the rent is not really covering all the expenses of the property. But when we start getting into sort of commercial territory, like is that why someone is investing in commercial, so that they can charge sort of whatever amount they can get, and then it ends up being cash flow?
Well, the larger down payment is probably more of a lender requirement, but you touched upon a good point in terms of rent. When we're talking about houses and condos where you're renting out to tenants, we do have rent controls, right? So in other words,
more so now, especially after last year, right?
For sure. And what happens is you don't have the freedom to raise the rents however much you want. There are laws against that.
Yeah.
Whereas in a commercial property, these laws do not exist. So you dictate what the terms are. As long as you can write the lease, and as long as the lease expires, and you renew the lease with your tenant, you can dictate a new rate, and there's no restrictions on how much you can increase it by. So that certainly gives the power to the landlord or the investor to ensure that they would cash flow properly.
Okay, so speaking of that, we're going to talk a bit about the benefits of buying a commercial property and owning commercial property and being a commercial landlord. Let's say you rent out retail and you're renting to a coffee shop or a restaurant or a dentist or something like that. You can be sure that they want to be there for a long time.
Correct.
And so you're going to be renting to one tenant for a very long time versus this constant sort of revolving door of in and out tenants when you're doing residential, right? I mean, you do have long-term tenants in residential as well too, but people, their lives are constantly moving and constantly changing. But when a business is setting up shop, they want to be there. They want people to know that they're there, and they will continue to operate for a long time. So you will have more stability from a rent point of view.
Correct.
Also, the Residential Tenancies Act, like John touched upon earlier, does not apply. Pretty much you're on your own, right? So you need to have a lawyer, the landlord needs to have a lawyer, the tenant needs to have a lawyer, and you guys work it out amongst yourselves. So there's no minimum rent that you can charge, there's no maximum rent you can charge. So you can actually charge and hold a security deposit. That's totally legal in the commercial game, but you can't do it in Ontario in the residential game. So you can set a certain amount of rent escalations each year. So basically when you're doing the contract at the beginning with a tenant, you can establish what the rent will be for the next 5 or maybe even the next 10 years. Enough of me talking, we're going to go back to John now. So, I mean, there's a lot of changes happening in the commercial market right now, right? Like, retail used to be hot, but then now it's kind of like, it's kind of struggling a little bit. We can call that maybe the Amazon factor, or we're having changes in the industrial market as well, because obviously we have legalization of cannabis now, or it's happening very, very soon, and so we have a really strong push in the industrial side. What do you see? Like, what kind of opportunities do you find are a good opportunity for someone who wants to go from residential to commercial, or who wants to just expand their commercial portfolio right now? So what do you think?
Well, I want to at least talk about what other classes. So remember, I just mentioned the 4 main groups that lenders focus on are industrial, apartments, retail, and office tower. But there's a whole host of other types of asset classes that are also quite popular as well. And I'll just list them, like hotels, retirement homes, gas stations, schools, places of worship. So there's a lot of categories of commercial that that's out there. In terms of where I see a market, one of the ones I've always been a favorite of mine is the mixed use. The reason being is a great transition commercial asset for those who are looking to jump from just purely investing in residential to go commercial. I wouldn't recommend someone who owns 4 or 5 homes all of a sudden buy a $20 million retail plaza, because that's a big jump, and it's almost like not knowing how to swim and jumping in a deep end. That's too big a jump. A mixed use, it's really a combination of 2 rental units or 3 on the second floor, or multiple floors, and you have a retail at the bottom, sometimes a restaurant, a mom and pop store, dry cleaners, and lots of various types of commercial retail units. And it's not very expensive. So what happens is that you can get into it without spending a lot of money and without the complexities of a very large commercial property. So that's one that I highly recommend for those who are jumping into it. Industrial is always a very popular type of investment for commercial real estate. One of the primary reasons are that it's just not a lot of them, and a lot meaning in terms of supply.
Well, we have so much space and so much land out in the GTA, right? You know.
Yeah, just historically, we've built a lot of retail. That seems to be a lot of the activity, and so as we're moving away from manufacturing, because a lot of things are being outsourced to other countries, we just don't have a lot of industrial. They still exist. It just wasn't many of them built.
So you'd have a tough time finding industrial property right now, right?
So generally speaking, they're out there, but there's just not a lot of supply. So I think that's always based on the supply and demand. That's always a good option to get into. Longer. We just saw flying garbage cans. So as I was mentioning, for those who want who have a longer term view of real estate, they might consider. I've seen recently there's interest in hotels, retirement homes, and schools. Not just because they want to run those businesses, it's because it sits on land, which is very valuable. There's just not a lot of empty land now for development. So if one bought a hotel or a school, at some point they could decide to close that operations down, and it's already zoned for commercial, that it could be redeveloped into other things. So it's just another way of acquiring land, and it is a longer term view. So those are that's getting pretty popular as well. Not as ideal for, again, as I mentioned, for those who are beginner commercial investors, but certainly down the road that's something to think about. And as I mentioned, right now the mixed use tends to be a very good transition type of commercial property.
Okay, well, I mean, we could talk about commercial real estate for a very long time. Thank you so much, John, for being on the show. I really appreciate it. Your knowledge and your experience is definitely valuable in this space. So if you guys have any questions about commercial real estate and how you can get into this part of the real estate, I keep saying game, but I don't know why. I don't know why I keep thinking commercial real estate is a game. It's actually very serious. It's very serious, and it's very long term. So whenever you're getting into anything like that, your time horizon is probably around 10, maybe even 20 years in terms of ownership and taking care of this property. People that have been getting involved with is sort of land banking, getting in the way of a developer potentially. So if that's something that interests you, there are many opportunities still in downtown Toronto that you can purchase a property and hold it for the next 10 years, and maybe somebody's going to pay you a pretty penny for it when it comes time to be developed and gentrified. So thank you so much, John, again, for being on the show.
Thank you, Peter, for inviting me.
You were fantastic,
Thank
and we hope that you guys will contact us when you need help on your next commercial property. Till then, see you next time. It's warming up in here, so I'm going to need to turn on the AC so John doesn't melt in the car here. How does John look? Okay, looks pretty. Yeah, you can't really see it that well, though. How's it going, man?
Oh, it's good. Thank you.
Good, yeah?
Yeah.
Thanks for doing this, by the way.
Oh, you're welcome.
Really appreciate it. I told you he knows a lot of stuff, man, this guy.